to our special guest, Chris Hedges, to those individuals, friends, representatives of civil rights, social justice, workers, women's organizations, ethical groups, churches, newcomers, longtime members, welcome. We are delighted to have you with us on Zoom today for our Anti-Racism Action Group's second program in our series on empowering the vote, and it's with Chris Hedges today. As a member of the Anti-Racism Action Group, our chair, Rose Creighton of Community Church of New York, Unitarian Universalist, and our co-chair, Ellen Rader of Ethical Culture, have requested that I, Faye Bennett Lord, UN, Women, Global Concerns, and anti-racism activist, should serve as moderator, for which I am happy to do. Our host is Esther Rosado, Director of Lifespan Religious Education. Our facilitator is Carrie McAvoy, Intern Minister. Reverend Peggy Clark is Senior Minister of Community Church of New York. Reverend Chris Long is Assistant Minister and ex officio of the Anti-Racism Action Group. Our distinguished members are David D. Strawn, author of Playing the Game from 2015, Diana Stewart, Patty Paris, our amanuensis, Daniel Etchlin, our wonderful activist, and Marianne Roncoli, who will shortly introduce our guest speaker, Chris Hedges, to you. The Anti-Racism Action Group held its first Empower the Vote opening program of the Zoom series on June 13th, 2021. For this second program today, during Women's History Month, with the long-awaited confirmation of a Black woman as Supreme Court Justice, with continuing challenges to voting rights, to increased unpaid labor demands upon women, to the loss of protection for various women, refugees, immigrants, prisoners, to various conflicts and coups in Africa, climate issues, an ongoing pandemic, and an unnecessary and horrendous war in Ukraine, and numerous other controversies, this Anti-Racism Action Group selected the topic, Empowering the Vote, Countering Race, Class, and Caste Propaganda. A caste is a form of social stratification determined by one single factor, that is, ritualistic legitimation of authority. Class of a person is based on multiple factors like income, education, occupation, economic status, power, achievements, so on. Race is a social construct. Anthropologically, there's no such thing as race. Propaganda is the dissemination of information, facts, arguments, rumors, half-truths, or outright lies to influence public opinion. Deliberateness and a relatively heavy emphasis on manipulation distinguish propaganda from casual conversation or the free and easy exchange of ideas. The Anti-Racism Action Group sincerely believes that the fight for equality is important to securing a democratic country, and we believe that an informed populace is best equipped to dismantle racism, whether as an individual or as a group. We hope you will relax and enjoy this program with us today. We turn now to Carrie McAvoy, who will offer a spiritual presence and who will share the chat rules.
Hello, welcome all. I would now like to share words of invocation written by Heather Janulis. From the power of our memory and history, with high hopes for the days that lie ahead, we gather to craft the destiny we share with one another. We gather in faith in the practice of democracy. We gather with hearts and minds open to the wisdom in every voice among us. In our gathering, may we dream and design a bold future. May we bring our best selves to this time together, and may we dream these dreams and do this work with love. May it be so. So that we may be fully present for our speaker today, we will turn off the chat function until the end of the presentation before questions and answers. You may still chat with the hosts if any technical needs arise. Through our presence here today, I know we understand that all people deserve to be heard with open minds and hearts. Today, I ask that we interact with each other with a spirit of mutual respect and care. And now back to Faye.
Well, thank you, Carrie. But we would like to move on to our member, Marianne Roncoli, who will introduce our very guest speaker.
Thank you, Faye. Chris Hedges, welcome. To begin, we know that you graduated from seminary at Harvard Divinity School, and you were a foreign correspondent for nearly 2 decades for the New York Times, the Dallas Morning News, the Christian Science Monitor, and NPR. You were part of a team of reporters of the New York Times that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for coverage of global terrorism. You've taught at Columbia, NYU, Princeton, the University of Toronto, in addition to teaching college credit courses in prison through Rutgers University. You are the author of numerous books: War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War on America, America, The Farewell Tour, as well as the 2021 book, Our Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. Welcome, Chris Hedges.
Thank you very much. When I was a boy in the 1960s, my father was a Presbyterian minister. He was a veteran of World War II. He'd been a sergeant in North Africa. He was very involved in the anti-war movement. We look to the Barragans, concerned clergy and laity, as kind of the template for social resistance by clergy, by the religious. He was very involved in the civil rights movement. We lived in an all-white farm town in upstate New York. This was at a time, we forget, when Martin Luther King in these rural white enclaves was one of the most hated men in America. And then my father, because my uncle, his youngest brother, was gay, was very outspoken about GBLTQ rights, which deeply angered the church, essentially seeing him pushed out after 40 years as a Presbyterian minister. That, although I was a boy, that moment in the 60s, I think is important because we saw the rise of popular movements, the Black Power movement, the Indian movement, feminists, the anti-war movement, we forget the environmental movement. The first Earth Day was in 1970, organized by Ralph Nader. The consumer rights movement, which of course Ralph ran. All of this was a time when we began to push back against entrenched systems of power. And then we got the counter-revolution. It really began in 1971 with the Powell memo. Lewis Powell, who was at that time the attorney for the Chamber of Commerce, was later appointed to the Supreme Court, laid out the kind of blueprint where the ruling elites would deal with what the political scientist Samuel Huntington called our excess of democracy. And that infusion, and actually Powell names Nader by name in terms of one of the targets, but we saw tremendous infusion of resources by the business and corporate elites into all of the institutions that had built alliances with these popular movements, academia, the church, the press, and we began to recreate a kind of corporate tyranny. John Ralston Saul calls what happened a kind of coup d'etat in slow motion. The leading civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King, of course, and Malcolm X, understood that without economic justice, there could never be racial justice, that you could bring in a certain segment of the black bourgeoisie. Clarence Thomas would be a kind of perfect example to do the dirty work of both white supremacy and unfettered, unregulated capitalism. And of course, King, as you all know, was killed in Memphis in the midst of supporting a strike by sanitation workers. And I think this is very important because what the ruling elites were quite successful at doing was divorcing the issue of race from the issue of class. And they also created a kind of species of corporate colonialism where they brought in people of color willing to do their bidding and yet perpetuate the system. I think you could argue that for certainly African Americans in deindustrialized urban centers, economically, not just economically, but socially and even culturally, life is probably worse than when King marched in Selma. And so this process had two prongs. One, it essentially sought to eradicate any discussion of class, which was an extremely important understanding by the movements in the 1960s. And at the same time, it championed this rapacious neoliberalism, unfettered capitalism, whatever term you want to use, which saw the country deindustrialized. And huge sections of the working class were rendered redundant. And we'll talk about the differences between Black urban centers and the white working class. They were both rendered redundant, but the forms of social control were very different. So as these Detroit and Newark and all of these inner cities were essentially stripped of any well-paying jobs, then you saw the infusion of militarized police and the massive expansion of the carceral state. And we have to acknowledge that this was done in large part by the Democratic administration of Bill Clinton. So it was Clinton, of course, that passed NAFTA, and Biden. Biden was an instrumental figure in the Senate at the time, pushing this through. And it was Clinton and Biden that really created this militarized police, what Malcolm X would call these internal armies of occupation, and exploded the prison population. We had about 700,000 prisoners when Clinton came into office. That had almost doubled by the time he left. Now it's 2.3 million. That is the 25% of the world's prison population, although we're less than 4%. And why? Why did you send militarized police that can kill with impunity, as we see repeatedly in story after story? George Floyd or Eric Garner. I mean, the list is kind of endless. It's because those became the forms of social control. Emile Durkheim, the great sociologist, when he writes his book on suicide, asks, what is it that drives individuals and societies to commit self-destructive acts? And he targets social bonds. And he said, with a rupture of these social bonds, all of these mechanisms that integrate you into a society, when those are gone, then people lash out in ways that are self-destructive. So that would be, of course, suicide was his main focus, but also self-destructive behavior, gambling, of course, the opioid crisis, sexual sadism. We are a completely pornified society. Right-wing hate groups. It's interesting that Durkheim argues that the lust for the annihilation of the other is driven by a desire for self-annihilation. So people are pushed into these very dark pathologies. And then, of course, when you strip meaningful employment out of any community, what you're doing is pushing a very large segment of that community in order to survive into the illegal economy, the underground economy. And that's where we got the 3 strikes, you're out law. I've been teaching in the New Jersey prisons since 2010, and I will periodically teach students who have life sentences, and they were never charged with committing a violent crime. It's all drugs. Aside from that, we have a broken judicial system. Excuse me, 20 or 94% of all of the people in our prison system are forced to plea out. Coerced is a better word, to plea out. And the way they are coerced to plea out to sentences that are 2 to 3 times longer than they are anywhere else in the world is that they're stacked with all sorts of charges that they didn't commit. Now, the police know that they didn't commit them. The prosecutors know they didn't commit them. But those are used as bargaining chips. So the students that I teach in the prison who have the longest sentences are invariably the ones who went to trial, and sadly, the ones who almost always didn't commit the crime and believed naively that the system would validate their innocence. In fact, they, by going to trial with a public attorney who maybe spends 10 or 15 minutes on their case, serve sentences that are far longer than others who took the plea. And that's a kind of example. So you had, what Marx calls this surplus population, this redundant labor. You needed effective forms of social control, and those became occupation forces, many of them modeled on the kind of occupation forces on the outer reaches of empire. I would argue that a night raid in Oakland doesn't look any different from a night raid in Fallujah. Doors are kicked in at 2 in the morning. SWAT teams are carrying long-barreled weapons with Kevlar vests, terrorizing the people inside. And this, of course, is what always happens in a declining empire. Thucydides writes about it on the Peloponnesian War, that the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. So you create this kind of judicial, policing, carceral mechanism to contain poor people of color, primarily. Of course, that is the disproportionate number of those in our prison population. But what has been visited on people of color in former urban industrial centers has also been inflicted on the white working class. So in my book, America, the Farewell Tour, I was in Anderson, Indiana. Anderson, Indiana was one of the major production points for GM cars. 25,000 unionized jobs. After NAFTA, those plants were packed up and moved to Monterrey, Mexico, where Mexican workers are paid $3 an hour without benefits to do the same work. And then because of trade deals, these vehicles cross the Mexican border back into the United States. So Anderson went into the kind of tailspin that you see in many urban centers. Of course, there was an explosion in the opioid crisis, suicides. The largest, statistically, the largest number of, or the category that has the largest number of suicides in the United States are middle-aged white men. I think that gets back to an essay James Baldwin wrote where he talked about why black men didn't have a midlife crisis the way white men did, because black men understood the game was fixed from childhood on, but white men could believe the myth until, of course, they were cast aside. So you go to Anderson, and it looks like, many of the kind of post-industrial centers around the country. The churches are boarded up. When I was reporting there, the supermarket in the poorest part of town was actually closing, which meant, especially if you didn't have a car, this is quite difficult. The closest supermarket were miles away. I wrote in Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt out of West Virginia. There weren't any supermarkets at all. People had to buy their food at gas stations, at convenience stores. It was all, fast food. I mean, and then with all the attendant health problems that come with eating junk. And what I spent a lot of time with the old UAW workers in Anderson. And what was interesting is this was during the election of 2016. Most of them voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, but in the general election, they voted for Trump. And they voted for Trump because they were acutely aware of what Bill Clinton and the Democratic leadership had done, how by pushing through NAFTA, along with a series of other measures, destroying the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act that put up a firewall between investment and commercial banks, deregulating the FCC, destroying welfare. I mean, we shouldn't forget that it was the Clinton administration that destroyed our welfare system, and 70% of the original recipients on welfare were children. And I think the Democrats were completely blind to the anger and the legitimate anger. In terms of voting, I think we have to also acknowledge that because of the criminalization in urban centers, we have stripped millions of people have been stripped of their right to vote because of felony convictions. That's something that a lot of my students who have gotten out are now organizing to help overcome. But when it's one step forward and two steps back, as we saw in Florida and other states. So this economic crisis, I think, is extremely important to understanding the dynamics of race in the United States. So what happened with the white working class is that they were repeatedly told by right-wing demagogues and these kind of neo-Christian fascists that have now controlled the Republican Party, that their well-being, their lives, the future of their families were sacrificed to help or to assist or to give aid to poor people of color, or all of those liberal groups that become kind of targets for the right wing. Of course, statistically, this isn't true. I mean, African American families since the 2008 crash have suffered economically far more grievously than white families. But at this point, what you're doing, with this kind of fake news is responding to an emotional need. It's not rational. Of course, racism is never rational. And if you respond to that emotional need, Trump was very good at this, then facts don't matter. And that gets to the issue of where we are with race. It is extremely important for the ruling elites. The concentration of wealth by this oligarchic elite is unlike anything we've ever seen in American history. If you look at the fortunes amassed by oligarchs of previous generations, it's nothing compared to the fortunes that have been amassed today. So when David Rockefeller died, I think he was worth about $3 billion. Even the worst kleptocrats, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, I think were worth about $10 billion. But today we have figures like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, who each are worth over $200 billion. This concentration of wealth, Aristotle writes about it and correctly points to it as extremely dangerous. He said that when wealth is concentrated in, he calls them an aristocratic elite like that, then Aristotle says you only have two choices, that's tyranny or revolution. So what we have seen are, I think, two, and I'm very frightening trajectories. The Republican Party, which there was just an article in the Times yesterday about the Democrats meeting for a retreat, and many of them being, of course, deeply despondent because of the paralysis of the Biden administration and saying that it's extremely likely now that the Republicans will take over both the House and the Senate, and leaving, as Biden said, his single prerogative essentially being a veto, the ability to veto. And so on the one hand, you have the Democratic Party, which is funded, of course, by corporate elites, which it cannot alienate. However well-meaning, I think there are figures in the Democratic Party who are well-meaning, they remain paralyzed because of our money-saturated elections. Remember, Clinton raised $1 billion for the presidential campaign. So they're so beholden to these interests that they can't push through the kinds of reforms. The Build Back Better bill is completely gutted. They can't push through the kinds of reforms that would address this kind of alienation and suffering on both throughout the working class and among the working poor. And so the reactions are different. Within urban centers with poor people of color, we've largely criminalized the ability of Black people to have guns in the United States, especially if you live in an urban center. My family's from Maine. The guy across the road from us has 23 weapons. I mean, these aren't just, it's not for hunting. I used to hunt. I'm a vegan now, but I grew up hunting. And AR-15s are useless as hunting rifles. The caliber of the bullet is too small, unless you want to put 20 bullets in a deer or something. They're designed to kill people. That's it. And you have, I don't know, we don't know the exact figure, but 1.5 million, 2 million of these weapons are in hands. And of course, then we have all the nihilistic school shootings and mall shootings and everything else. So you have among a dispossessed and enraged white working class, you've weaponized it. You've fed it with these non-reality based conspiracy theories to essentially give them a vent for their anger. Richard Rorty wrote a book quite prescient book. I think he wrote it in '98 called Achieving Our Country. And he talks about how all the sadism that the liberal elites attempted to address within the society, particularly among the white society, is going to come back with a vengeance. And that all the old racist tropes and overt bigotry will essentially be back within the mainstream. And that, of course, is precisely what happened. The upcoming elections, I think, are important. I don't think it was accidental that figures like Stacey Abrams and other voting rights campaigners in Georgia did not show up to the Biden event when he was there, because the Biden White House, other than kind of rhetorically, has not responded to this very concerted Republican effort to redistrict and gerrymander in a way that will ensure that poor people and people of color have really no voice in the electoral process. Unfortunately, this kind of redistricting is not exclusive to the Republican Party. My friend Dennis Kucinich, who was in the House, had his district gerrymandered by the Democratic elite in Ohio so that he would lose his House seat, which he did. He just ran in November for the mayor of Cleveland. He had been the mayor of Cleveland. He was ahead in the polls until 3 weeks before the election. And then you saw massive amounts of dark money, corporate money, coming into the system and, of course, putting in a pro-corporate candidate. So we've divorced the issue of class and race, and this serves the interest of the ruling elites because they are always able to find figures, Ben Carson, I mean, there's no shortage of them, who fulfill the race requirement, but serve this system of white supremacy and unfettered capitalism. So they can talk about race but they can't talk about race and class. And as we kind of barrel forwards, the inability on the part of this Democratic administration to address the dislocation and disenfranchisement means that that will become exacerbated. As was mentioned in the introduction, I wrote a book called American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War in America. I did not use the term fascist lightly. I, of course, have a seminary degree. I grew up in the church. For me, these are Christian heretics. You don't need to, as I did, spend 3 years at Harvard Divinity School to recognize that Jesus didn't come to make us rich, that Jesus would not bless the dropping of iron fragmentation bombs up and down the Middle East, that Jesus did not see the white race. Jesus, by the way, wasn't white. Jesus was a person of color. The Romans were white. But he didn't bless the white race, especially the American white race, to carry out the Christian project. This is just an anathema. It's a complete distortion of the Bible, and part of my frustration with the liberal church, which I come out of, is that it didn't call these people out for who they are in the name of tolerance, which is a word Martin Luther King never used, and essentially gave them a kind of religious legitimacy. I was very influenced by a great scholar at Harvard, James Luther Adams, Unitarian, who he was 80 when I had him. He had been in Germany in 1935 and 1936. He was bilingual in German at the University of Heidelberg. He was at lectures where Martin Heidegger actually began the lectures with the Nazi salute. He dropped out. He joined the Confessing Church led by Niemöller, later Bonhoeffer. I think Bonhoeffer went in 35 and 36, may have still been at Union Theological. But Albert Schweitzer, he knew all these people, Karl Barth, and he saw it was a very nascent movement when I was in divinity school in the early 80s, but he saw in that movement a parallel to the so-called German Christian Church, which was pro-Nazi and which had fused the kind of symbols of the Nazi Party, the iconography of the Nazi Party, with the symbols and iconography of the Christian religion. And I remember him telling, he was certainly one of the most brilliant professors I ever had, but I remember him telling us that when we were his age, we would all be fighting the Christian fascists. And that's, of course, what we've come down to. The ideological void of Donald Trump, who's, of course, as we all know, just a narcissist and a megalomaniac, was filled by the ideology of the Christian right. And of course, he brought many of these figures, Mike Pence, Betsy DeVos, Ben Carson, Mike Pompeo, into the centers of power, but not just at the senior level, but throughout the system, recruiting out of these parallel institutions that had been created by the Christian right, Liberty University, Patrick Henry Law School, etc. And for me, having spent 2 years with this group, the Christian right is the heir to the KKK, which, as Paxton, who wrote The Anatomy of Fascism, wrote, was our most authentically fascist movement. Remember, every KKK chapter had a chaplain. They began with a prayer. They set up a kind of altar with a Christian cross and usually a Bible and a gun on it. And so that strain of kind of Christian fascism is not something that just erupted with Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell, but it's long been embedded within white America, because it is the kind of religious expression of white supremacy. And so, just to close, I'll raise, where do we go? How do we respond? I think, first of all, we have to address the fundamental issue of class dislocation if we're ever going to address the accelerated expressions of racism that are gripping our very troubled society. and that's got to be done, I think, by finding or making common cause with those movements, whether it's Starbucks workers or Amazon workers that are pushing back against corporate capitalism. So in my students in the prison who are earning their degree through Rutgers University, some of them finish the degree in prison, but if they are released and they haven't finished the degree and they have a 3.1 average, they can matriculate to Rutgers. And a lot of my students, very, very bright, talented men and women, I've taught in the women's prison in New Jersey too, they got to Rutgers and they've been organizing the food service workers, the maintenance workers at Rutgers. They're black, they're all black. But what's interesting, they're telling me, is that what they're doing, they're organizing workers who are Trump supporters. And I think that is where it goes. I think that when you begin to, and of course any successful labor movement is not just about protecting workers' rights, but it's about education. It's about explaining how power works. And so there is a kind of process of enlightenment that comes with it. What was it, Lord Salisbury, who said, there's no permanent allies, there's only permanent power. That's a line Saul Alinsky liked to use. But I think that it is incumbent upon all of us to grasp that it's not just the racist dog whistles and tropes that emanate daily from the Republican Party that have to be fought, but it's also the rapacious assault by corporate forces that have distorted the world and fed this kind of racism, because entities like Fox News or Newsmax, all these right-wing places are never going to confront the real centers of power. They are always going to try to focus on scapegoats, and those that we know what that list looks like. It's the same list for any fascist or neo-fascist movement. It's blacks, it's undocumented people, it's LGBTQ people, it's liberals, it's intellectuals, it's artists, real journalists. Those are always the targets. And I worry deeply. I think that Biden in many ways may have been our last chance to halt a rising kind of authoritarianism. I think the Democratic Party has failed us in terms of not intervening aggressively to block the very heavy-handed tactics that are being used by a Republican Party that at this point has no pretense of even being democratic institutions. I mean, they're trying to get state attorney generals in power who will oversee the vote count, who believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. So the Republicans have always been a minority. I mean, we forget these figures like Trump, George W. Bush. They didn't win with a plurality because of the electoral college. What did Hillary Clinton won 3 million more votes than Trump, and Trump's president. So the system is distorted politically. The system is distorted economically. But I think the most important issue that I want to stress today is that we are not going to address the cancer of racism in this country, which is reaching frightening levels, unless we also address the issue of class. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for your brilliant insights and provocative presentation. The Anti-Racism Action Group desired a speaker who could unravel the lies. And of course, where do we go from here to empower the vote? We have an audience from Illinois, Alabama, New Jersey, parts of the country. So we'll open up the question and answer period. And to handle the chat, we'll turn to Carrie McAvoy and Esther Rosado, our facilitators.
Our first question asks if our speaker can offer us any hope.
I don't really share the culture's mania for hope. I think partly because I spent so many years covering wars. I certainly to this audience, I think we have to speak in the language of morality, the moral imperative of fighting what Kant would call radical evil. In the end, I don't fight fascists because I'll win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. And I despair. I mean, the last acceptable prejudice in the left is the prejudice against people who come out of a tradition of faith. I come out of that tradition. I remember asking Daniel Berrigan once how he defined faith. And he said it's the belief that the good draws to it the good, even if empirically everything around you says otherwise. And I can tell you, having been in extreme situations, that the good does draw to it the good, that you, by standing up, you can often create a kind of invisible witness, and that my father is this for me. So people walked out of his sermons. I, in the town, heard people say as a boy very hurtful things about my father when the church told him that he was not allowed to campaign for gender equality and the ordination and marriage of GBLTQ people and all this stuff. His response was to hold an Easter service in the city of Syracuse for the GBLTQ community. And I was at Colgate as an undergraduate then. In fact, there was no gay or lesbian group at Colgate. My father brought the gay speakers to the campus and kept telling the students they had to come out and form an organization, that they couldn't remain hidden. And they were too frightened. Colgate is a very frat-driven, football-driven school. And so one day my father drove down and took me out to lunch and said, even though I'm heterosexual, well, you have to found it. So I did. I founded it, and I would go into the dining hall, and they would take the checker used to take my card for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, check it off, and hand it back and go, faggot. And so my father held this service, and he came and got me. He said, it's one of the last times you'll ever hear me preach. And I went into that church, and these were people who the church had very cruelly treated. And it was just electric. I mean, the emotion within the congregation. And I remember I was seated up front. There was two women holding hands. They were holding their hands so tightly, their hands were white. Just all the blood had been drained out of their hands. And my father got up in the pulpit and said, marriage is a sacrament. It is not a reward for being a heterosexual. And any church that does not honor the sacrament of marriage does not deserve to call itself Christian. And he was out. Now, for me, hope comes in these kind of small gestures of justice and sacrifice, this good drawing to it the good. So as you heard, I teach in a prison. I have one student who was, his parents had died. He was living in an abandoned house at the age of 12 in Camden, New Jersey, per capita the poorest city in America. There's a rape and a murder. He's illiterate. He's functionally illiterate. He's grabbed by 3 detectives, hauled into a police station. He has no legal representation, no parental support. He's all alone. He weighs 90 pounds, and they force him to sign a confession. This isn't uncommon, by the way. It's just they want to get rid of the case. And he couldn't even read what was in the confession. And he gets to court, and he hears what supposedly he has confessed to, and he attempts to protest, and they beat him down. And so remember, at this point, he's 14 years old, and he's sentenced as an adult. He's not convicted, and he's not eligible to go before a parole board until he's 70. That means he can't even ask for parole till he's 70. So he's one of my best students. He works so hard. I mean, if I mention a book, he will go out and get it, and remember, you're only making $28 a month in a prison. A book is quite an expense. And I was teaching a history class called Conquest. We read Open Veins of Latin America, Bury My Heart, A Wounded Knee, and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins. he was, as usual, one of the handful of A students in the class. He waits till everyone is about to leave the class, and he says, I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I work so hard because one day I'm going to be a teacher like you. And he walks out. Now that's hope for me. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that the internal armies of occupation and the dysfunctional courts won't funnel more people in it. But that's hope. It comes in that ability of the good to reach the good. I mean, I was in Wenceslas Square in 1989 in Prague, covering the Velvet Revolution, when Marta Kubasheva, so she had been the great, iconic singer in Czechoslovakia before 1968, and she had this song, this anthem called A Prayer for Marta, which was broadcast over the airwaves during the Soviet invasion as an anthem of defiance. And when Dubček was overthrown and the pro-Soviet regime was installed, she was banned from the airwaves. Her recording stock was destroyed. She had spent the intervening years working on an assembly line in a toy factory. And I was in the Magic Lantern Theater every night with Havel and Dinsmore and everybody who would eventually assume leadership. And I was in Wenceslas Square, 500,000 Czechs, most of whom born after 1968. And she walked out on the balcony and she began to sing A Prayer for Marta, and every Czech in the crowd knew every word. That's what hope is. It is about, it's a spiritual, it's not an empirical reality.
Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Marianne Roncoli, one of the members of the Anti-Racism Action Group. In American Fascists, you explain how the Christian right is sabotaging democracy. How do you see liberal congregations such as ours, Community Church of New York, responding to and interacting with the fundamentalist Christian church? How can our respective faiths transcend any political agenda?
Well, by building around building a common cause around an oppressive force. So, for instance, organizing workers in an Amazon warehouse, you are inevitably going to have Trump workers, and it's by building those alliances, and not just rhetorically saying that you care about their suffering, but doing something to address. We can't defend how they have responded. How they have responded is unconscionable, but the fact is they have legitimate grievances, and by reaching out and addressing those legitimate grievances and helping them fight back is the most effective way to begin to break down this kind of racism. I don't consider the Christian right as a legitimate Christian organization. They have acculturated the worst aspects of American capitalism, white supremacy, racism, militarism, imperialism into the Christian faith. And I went, when I wrote this book, I had all of the prejudices that many of us who come out of the liberal church have, which I carried into my investigation. But I couldn't hear these stories of the followers without having a great deal of empathy for what they went through. Sexual abuse, domestic abuse, struggles with addictions, alcoholism, gambling, everything else, evictions, foreclosures, all of that stuff is real. And at the end of the book, I say, if we want to fight the Christian right, we have to reintegrate them into the society, because we're not going to argue them rationally. It's not a rational belief system. So it's that we have to stand for who we are, but we have to be proactive in rising up on behalf even of people whose particular viewpoints are ones that are an anathema to us. And that I think is the mechanism.
Thank you. Our next question is asking if you could repeat the name of the book about white, black males and midlife crises.
That's from James Baldwin. It's the wonderful essay, Toni Morrison edited them. I think it's an Everyman edition. Well, the thing, I'm a writer, and Baldwin drives me crazy because the guy didn't write one word that wasn't brilliant. It's like not one bad essay in the book. It's like kind of like Flannery O'Connor. But it's in that book. The thing is, there's probably several hundred essays. So off the top of my head, I don't remember the name of which one it is. But anyway, you should read all of them.
Great. So another question is, the Democrats and Republicans are both corporate parties that serve the ruling elite. Why are we continuously urged to vote in midterm and presidential elections? Is voting more effective at the local level?
Well, it probably is more effective at the local level because you can run for a local office without having to amass. I think for a House member now has to get at least $1 million in order to mount a kind of credible campaign. I haven't voted for the Democrats since 2000. I was Ralph Nader's speechwriter. I have always voted Green. And the reason for this, and this was Ralph's argument, is that once 5, 10, 15 million of us step outside the system and begin to push back, that is the only mechanism we have left to pressure the Democratic Party, who potentially will hear us. But of course, every election cycle is frightened, and not without reason, but frightened into conforming to the Democratic Party. But the attacks on those of us who vote third party is a little specious, because the real issue are the 80 million people who don't vote, 80 million registered voters who don't vote. And that's the issue. And they don't vote, and I would include the families of many of my students, because Democrat, Republican make any difference to their lives. The Democrats can be just as mercenary as the Republicans. And so the problem is that the capture of the Democratic Party by corporate power has disenfranchised or alienated a huge section of the electorate, which, if the Democratic Party truly began to address their needs, we could probably get to the voting booths.
Okay, our next question is, today there are people who understand the system is corrupt, but still buy the lies and scapegoat the homeless and other ethnic groups for situations they find oppressive. How do you begin to address this in day-to-day encounters? I'm thinking of local small businessmen.
Well, I mean, part of the problem is education. I mean, the great thing about any labor movement, and we sometimes forget, a huge component of labor organizing was education. Labor workers went to classes. They studied how systems of power work. You read Emma Goldman, and she's working 12 hours a day in a sweatshop in the Lower East Side, and then they're all going to anarchist study groups at night. Because we're passive consumers of information, because the airwaves are just saturated with essentially messages that come from the corporate elites, we're entranced by the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave. And it's I always tell my students in the prison, by the time we finish, you're going to be very lonely, because it's going to be very hard for you as an intellectual who understands systems of power to communicate even with your own families. And I think I have found that to be true. And this gets into the whole collapse of the public school system and the rise of charter schools, which are all based around STEM, enough numerical literacy in the inner city so you can work at Walmart or stack shelves in a warehouse or work at fast food. But the thing about the humanities is that it's not teaching you what to think, it's teaching you how to think. It's teaching you how to ask questions, which are inherently subversive. Education should be subversive. So a lot of this has to do with the collapse of the American education system, which was by design. I mean, that was by design. And these charter schools, especially in inner cities, are just criminal.
Our next question comes from another member of the Anti-Racism Action Group. Do you think Democrats could have passed Build Back Better if Sarah Gideon defeated Sue Collins in Maine?
The problem is that with figures like Manchin and others who blocked the bill, is that there's no political price they pay for being obstructionist. Because, of course, they have corporate backing. So if you take Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or anyone else who might have a proclivity to stand up to Pelosi and the Democratic leadership, the cost is they lose their seat, that they're destroyed, and they know it, which is why they've been domesticated. And so I don't think it gets down to this particular senator, that particular senator. I think it gets down to a system where corporate power is a complete lock on legislation. Remember, most of this stuff's written by lobbyists, and even the Build Back Better bill, like any bill, just is constant as one addendum after another that comes out of K Street. I mean, a lot of the money is going to go to states or go to corporations. It's not going to go to people. I mean, the whole system's distorted. I was very involved in the single payer fight, and Obama sold us out. He sold us out. And they had Fowler, Liz Fowler was her name, who was a lobbyist for the health insurance industry, writing it. So it's I think it's wrong to target individual figures. I think we have to step back and understand that the entire system is corrupt.
So our next question is a longish one. As you described today, the major institutions of American society, like the courts and legislature, have been taken captive by corporations and oligarchs. We have seen the consolidation of media to the extent that competing perspectives cannot be introduced to help form consciousness, never mind the school curricula. How do we ensure that young people, increasingly drawn into online distractions and soon artificial intelligence, do not retreat in despair to the matrix of an alternate reality?
Well, that is the question. I mean, the problem is, as a society, we don't read. So you can get the books. You can get Gramsci and David Harvey and Cornel West, and you can get all those books, but people don't read them. You're never going to understand complex thought or complex ideas or systems of power from what you get off of an internet. And that I wrote a book called Empire of Illusion: The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle that addresses that issue. So that is a deep, deep concern of mine. And what's interesting about teaching in the prison is that they don't have access to social media. They read the books, which is why they're so smart. I mean, the level of discussion that I have in that classroom, I've taught at Princeton. It's at a level that Princeton can't even reach. Because my students in the prison understand white supremacy. They understand neoliberalism. They understand the reconfiguration of the country into a kind of corporate tyranny because they're victims of it. Those things aren't debated. And so we begin with a level of sophistication. At Princeton, they're all training to be members of the 1%. I mean, there was a few years ago, there was the Bard prison debate team debated Harvard and won. It was national news, and everybody thought, oh, this is amazing. Prisoners beat. Well, those of us who teach in the prison weren't surprised.
Our next question is, have you attempted an effort to appeal the conviction of the student you referenced?
Yeah, I got a lawyer, and because he was convicted as an adult, as a juvenile, under the Miller Supreme Court tradition ruling, he is subject to he can have a resentencing hearing, which means that they don't determine his guilt or his innocence, but they will address the length of his sentence. That was a 2-year process. And he doesn't have any family, so I was in court as his, witness. One of the very few times I put on a clerical collar. I hate wearing them. And he was granted release for time served, but they won't release you from a prison unless you have an address. He didn't have an address, so I raised the money, $20,000, to rent him an apartment for a year because we needed to show the judge a lease. And then my garage was filled with household items, because even cooling clothes, because he didn't have anything, all donated by formerly incarcerated people. And he finished Rutgers and graduated summa cum laude. And he's now working as a community organizer in Brooklyn and driving my old car.
Another question, there doesn't seem to be much hope in the situation as you describe it. So how to encourage non-voters to vote?
I don't think we need to go out and browbeat non-voters. I don't think it's their fault they don't vote. I think it's the fault of the Democratic Party to not responding to the distress that they're under. So I think it's inverted. We shouldn't make them feel guilty. They would vote if there were real substantial improvements in their lives, but there aren't any. In fact, it's worse under Biden, because he promised to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. He didn't do it. He promised to forgive student debt. He didn't do it. We're seeing the revoking of the moratorium on foreclosures and evictions. The supplemental welfare income is off. The $2,000 checks don't exist anymore. Things are worse.
Here's another question. How do you see, if at all, Stacey Abrams' efforts adding to or changing the discourse?
I think she's done heroic work, but as she will tell you, she has not gotten support from the Democratic hierarchy, which is why all of the voting rights activists in Georgia boycotted the Biden event. I mean, Biden can use executive orders on voting rights issues, but he won't do it. So I think there's a kind of betrayal on the part of the grassroots figures like Stacey Abrams that are attempting to address this issue.
Okay. Wouldn't the Build Back Better program have met some of the needs of the prospective voters?
It would have met some of them. The way the money was allocated, it would go to like construction corporations or to state budgets, who would then determine who was hired and who was paid. So we'd have to see how it played out. Remember, with the gig economy, we're probably not talking about good unionized jobs, which is really what we have to recreate. But yes, I supported it. But at this point, in this article in the New York Times yesterday, they said on this retreat, they don't even mention the word Build Back Better anymore. It's like a curse. They won't even talk about it because they know it isn't going to happen.
Lee?
Great. Well, thank you for having me.
Well, we appreciate your presence here today. And we do want to acknowledge that we have different voices with different concerns in our Zoom audience. And of course, it becomes apparent that if you enjoy asking your own question with your own voice, rather than having someone, direct it in a more efficient manner, it may cause some discomfort among those who have had the experience to raise their hands and ask their own questions so it can be answered by the speaker. It's a matter of social recognition and equality and respect and all the other things that people who are in the struggle contend with. So we do want to share the concerns of our guests and our audience members. And we do thank our facilitators because they have been most efficient. But again, as Chris was describing, we have people who write bills and who get things done, and we do it, but sometimes we may not consider how it impacts all members at different class levels. So one last question about class. Is race a distraction, and is there some way to show how race and class can be used by the Democrats to more effectively lift up the voices of the poor and the middle group so that they will not continue to be straining at the margins towards revolution? Chris, any last words?
I think the more we address the issue of this class war, which is being waged by the oligarchic elite, to reintegrate people of every color, every ethnicity, every group into the economy, the more we will mitigate this kind of neo-fascism that is gripping the country. I really think that is the solution. And let's not forget that, class warfare always uses the trope of racism. It always looks for the scapegoat. As you get these economic distortions, it always seeks to shift the blame to the vulnerable, whether that's Weimar with Jews, whether that's poor people of color in the United States. That's what always happens, because of course they don't want people examining the centers of power and the real reasons behind their own disenfranchisement. I mean, that's just standard. And so, yeah, I think that if we're going to stop the rise of this kind of creeping authoritarianism, which I think will come in the garb of the Christian right, we have to be very aggressive about standing with workers who are fighting back against this system. And I will reiterate, including, as my students at Rutgers have done, standing with people who espouse views that we find distasteful.
Thank you. The Anti-Racism Action Group believes that the durability of racism in the United States is not only the result of discrimination against people of color, but a concerted attempt by the wealthy and powerful to divide America, not only by race, but also by class and caste, to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a privileged few at the expense of people of color. So at this time, we would like to thank our special guest, Chris Hedges. In recognition of your personal commitment, dedication, religious knowledge, social activism, and humanitarian services to anti-racism causes, for expertise on social justice, human rights, and cultural issues impacting all lives, especially those of women during this Women's History Month, and for your ability to deal with issues in hotspots around the world, and for being our special guest at this Empowering the Vote Forum, Countering Race, Class, and Caste Propaganda. We gratefully acknowledge your outstanding service on behalf of the Anti-Racism Action Group. Once this is signed, we hope we can get that to you.
Great.
And again, we would like to thank our Zoom presenters, Marianne Roncalli, Carrie McAvoy, our host, Esther Rosada of Community Church of New York, the CCNY staff, Reverend Peggy Clark, and of course, Reverend Chris Long. Special thanks to our chairs and co-chairs, Rose Creighton, Ellen Rader. Again, our members, David Strawn, Diana Stewart, Daniel Etchlin, Patty Paris. And we thank our wonderful Zoom audience who've come to us from different parts. We could ask how many from New Jersey, how many from Illinois, Alabama, but afterwards we'll get a chance to chat. But we thank you for your interest. Those who would like to leave an email and put it in the chat room to Carrie. So again, I'm Faye Bennett Lord, and on behalf of the Anti-Racism Action Group, we thank you and appreciate your time and attention. Continued blessings to all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.